Ultimately, here is what Paul wants in chapter 5. He wants them to be fruitful in their faith. If they're going to do that, they're going to have to take certain steps to get certain things straight. Don't worry, it never gets better. Okay? And so he's trying to get them, they've gotten out of one ditch, which is enslavement to Roman culture, and now they're choosing enslavement in a culture that isn't their own. And that is the main problem. And Paul is saying there are certain steps you can take to avoid this pitfall. Paul's using strong language as he describes the people who preach a different gospel than the one he teaches. And while on the topic of what we do with boy bits and knives, says to them, why don't you go the full way and cut it off completely? If you want to be cut off from the power and work of Christ so badly, why not take the next step and also cut yourself off from producing future generations of people who may be tempted to turn their back on Jesus too? Paul begins by centering the purposes of Jesus. Why did Jesus come? It is for freedom, to set us free. He sets us free for the purpose of freedom. Why did he drag us out of the ditch? It's to get us out of the ditch. And he begins by suggesting the central purpose of Christ is freedom from slavery. He warns them, don't get distracted by the circumcision debate and following the law. If they follow these rabbit holes, Jesus will wind up literally having no value to them whatsoever. And of course, in verse 6, Paul introduces the central idea of the book. All that matters is faith working itself out in love. So Paul's argument to the Galatian church is that they are not pointed in the right direction in this debate, and that it isn't going to lead toward a fruitful faith. Their desire for circumcision and all the things that go along with the Jewish way of life is not centered on what Jesus has done to set them free. Jesus has pulled them out of the ditch of slavery to their own culture, and almost immediately they're tempted to jump into the slavery of another culture. And Paul is begging them to reconsider. He's asking them to center themselves in the work of Jesus and his purposes in the world. Here's how N.T. Wright puts it. The Galatians know that they have already received the Spirit. Now they must learn and put into practice what the Spirit is given to produce. A single community. A single community. That's key here. Not competing communities of competing cultures, but a single community shaped and energized by the Messiah's own life. How Jesus actually lived. A life of cruciform, meaning shaped in the cross. Keep the mic in your mouth. A life of cruciform love reflecting that of the Messiah himself. And friends, this is the task of our church. This is the job at Lakeview. We, like all churches in all times, have to center ourselves on the work and purposes of Jesus. We have to ask, what does it mean to follow Jesus in Saskatoon? What does it look like here, right here? We aren't in Dallas, Texas. We aren't Toronto. We aren't Vancouver, and we certainly aren't Regina. The good news about Jesus is taking root in our city. It's taking root in our lives. And so knowing that, what does living into the true freedom of Jesus look like here? What does it look like for people like us to be followers of Jesus? What does it look like to follow Jesus as a person who works in healthcare, as a financial planner, as a framer, as a farmer, as a lawyer, as a school teacher? That was for you, Kimball. You might not be here, but I put a little English on the word lawyer there for you. As immigrants to this country, as indigenous people to these lands? What does it look like for people like us? And what does it look like to follow Jesus right now? Not 100 years ago, not 30 years ago, not 10 years ago, not even 3 years ago before the pandemic began, but right now, as this pandemic is shifting to an endemic, as our whole world is experiencing extreme inflation, as we are deeply divided as a country. And for us in specific, as we search for a new pastor, what does it look like now to be God's people? As we figure out what it means to be a 400-person church and not a 600 or 700-person church that we were before the pandemic, or the 800-plus person church that we were 10 years ago. Christ has come to set us free. The Spirit is with us. There is a life. The Father is leading us to live. So what are we leaning on, friends? Do we wish we were living somewhere else with other people at another time? Or can we be here now and be with each other? Paul's laundry list here are things that press against the Galatian church. They're the very real choices that their neighbors are making. These are very real life-destroying choices. These are very real temptations, and their neighbors are living into this stuff. But also, as a church, as people, they're tempted by this stuff, and some of this stuff still lives in them. And so Paul's warning against them. If the Galatian church wants to live into the freedom that Jesus has secured, they have to resist and renounce these things. And learning to do this work well, to resist the evil that's in our culture, is an act of love. It is an act of love for both themselves and for their neighbors. And then finally, Paul moves the conversation onto the way of the Spirit. The way that you can tell that you're dealing with people who have been shaped and rooted in the work of Christ. The easiest way to be sure is to look for the fruit of God to be growing among them. This is how we can tell when bad ideas start entering the church, when death-dealing ways of life start to take control. This fruit starts to disappear. Conversely, this is how we know when God is at work among us. Wherever you see love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, whenever you see that among that people, you'll know that God has been at work. And wherever you see something else, you'll know that God has some work to do, and those people have some work to do. So family, let's get on with it. Let's seek out and ask God for the fruit of the Spirit to grow in us. Let's put our whole faith in God to make it happen. Let's pin our hopes on God's ability to take us from where we are, this place, these people, this time, and to take us in the direction that God is going. Let's become a living example of what God can do with people like us. People whose hearts and lives are overflowing with love and joy and peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. These are the kinds of communities where darkness is in retreat. These are the kinds of communities that are good news in a sin-soaked world. These are the things that we can put our faith in. And so let's trust them together, let's pursue them together, and let's become them together.